and we're going to finish that and finish one last kind of piece in regards to just relating and walking alongside and being with people that are experiencing loss. The one thing I would just continue to remind you of, and this I think generally this is true for most people, is our the way that we go about containing the disruption of loss is to make some kind of comparison. So since I'm not dealing with something because somebody died, then mine isn't so bad. And I think I made the distinction even between pain is pain and what that actually looks like. So always keep that one in the back of your head. It's something that we have to continue to talk about and look at. The last kind of dimension outside of boundaries has to do, it's actually just as hard with somebody who's alive as it is with somebody who's died. And that's a piece of the puzzle, I think, that we have to contend with in one fashion or another. But so, any other questions or anything I need to answer or look at or talk about? Okay, let me pray and then we'll jump in. Father, guide our hearts and our minds into grasping and wrestling with the nature of who you are and the things that happen in our lives that only result in one question, that's why, and help us to find ways to be honest and willing to look at it directly, not to deflect it onto other people or to even go the easy route in just checking out, tapping out, and not engaging in it at all. So guide us into that place. I know it's hard, it's difficult, and yet your willingness to meet us there is incredible. So in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I think where we left off was on this particular slide. And the idea of boundaries and the nature of how we go about engaging in self-care is a vexing issue, to say the least, for a lot of people who would much rather help other people than actually take care of themselves. And that's a bigger part of that, as well as taking care and facing my own loss, my own grief and what I feel around that. It's always easier, and a lot of times people will take some measure of time, even when we talk about denial, to spend all of their time taking care of other people and never really looking at their own sense of loss that they've experienced. And really, that's over time. At the front end, it looks great because I've got a lot of passion, I've got a lot of motivation to work from. But over time, the power of the ability to actually pull that off wanes because we're draining, a pool that is very limited. So, and the other point that we ended with was the idea of our tendency is to underestimate the power of being present with somebody. That includes them when they are really, really angry, and still being present and not getting defensive and just allowing them to vent, because most of the time that's all really it is. So our tendency, certainly even in the academy, is to search for the right words to say that will make things better. And if I'm ever caught in that kind of pattern, then generally I have lost my focus as to the person that I'm interacting with, because I'm going internal, thinking about what can I say to make this better, and at that point I've already disengaged from the person. And we may not think of it that way, but generally even in your groups, that same thing occurs, is that somebody's talking or telling a story and you're searching the memory banks about what you were told maybe in a similar circumstance, and the moment that happens, our attention's very limited. And so the minute I pull away from that conversation and turn my attention to something else, I've also left my attention away from that other, or turned my attention away from that other person. So the other part of this that I think we have to look at, other examples that are part of the conversation, is what I refer to as context versus and connection. Versus content, education, and right thinking, and that's kind of wordy to be looking at it. But our tendency is to think of resources for the person without even really thinking about that. Our us being there is actually a resource for the person. The idea of connection, the idea of understanding the nature of the context in which, in terms of what I'm entering into. And entering into that context with a degree of healthy ignorance. In most cases, you can know the facts of the story, whatever that is, broken relationships, somebody walking out, whatever that might be. You know the facts of that, but you don't know how the person is experiencing it. And that's the context in which you're operating and in which you're entering. And that's the place where we kind of forget to ask those questions of what's going on here and how can I understand this, and asking a lot for the person to help me understand. Those three words are probably some of the most profound in our language, is help me understand. Partly because not only are they requesting information, but they are also admitting ignorance. And that goes a long way to freeing people to do just that, is helping us to understand. So the idea of context and connection typically oftentimes gets set kind of in opposition to the content and education and so forth. In a lot of the settings that occur around grief and grieving and loss and everything else, most of it is directed toward educating the person about the processes of grief and grieving and what it all is, and all that's good. All of it is good, but then ultimately you have to find someone that's willing to actually walk through that with the person and kind of help name it for them, help them to understand what it is they're going through. And more often than not, in the conversations certainly I have had, I spent a lot of time normalizing things for people, because most of their experiences are really never outside the realm of of just normal grieving and the content or the comments that they tend to make or the conclusions that they tend to make. So there's something to be said for that. My suspicion is, although it wasn't really designed that way, my suspicion for the reason my book continues to be published is because it's not an attempt to educate people. It really is an attempt in a book form to walk with people through what they're going through. And that's prototypical of engaging people in what they're experiencing and the questions that they might have in regards to that. The other one is distance, and ironically, at least in the whole world of grieving and everything like that, that whole world, we tend to walk away and assume that denial is bad, and denial is always bad. But it isn't. In a lot of cases, we're not designed to tackle everything that comes with a loss. We're not. And so if we think that kind of engaging it and keeping to engage it, and I'm not doing enough work, and I'm not doing it quite right, and things like that, robs us of some measure of just emotional distance from it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all. When I start using denial to be a coping mechanism to not deal with it versus just allowing myself a little room to breathe with it, then we can talk about it might be problematic. But in a lot of cases, and that's true. I mean, even if you go back to the metaphor I use in my book about a burn wound, the moment, just at the split second that you grab something that's really, really hot, or your finger touches something on the stove that's hot, in that split second that occurs, you feel nothing. because the nerves have been seared. And so they don't respond, and then they start responding. And in a sense, in the emotional world, that same thing is true, that we need some distance. And I had a good friend of mine that I used to work with, and she had a little boy, I forget, he must have been 5 or 6 years old, and he was diagnosed with acute myelocytic leukemia. Well, the interesting thing about that kind of leukemia is usually it afflicts older people. It doesn't afflict a little kid. And eventually he went through chemo, and there was kind of some ups and downs, and eventually he died. And one of the first things she did with her family is, for one, they did a private graveside. Didn't have a bunch of people around, to allow the family to grieve just the way they needed to grieve. And the next thing they did was they left. They left town, and they went someplace else, just to be able to get some distance from the little guy's room and all the other things that were just all reminders of the realities that they were living within. There was really nothing wrong with that. They needed some space from it because they had been really in the war with this little guy going through his chemo, and all the memories come with, and we all know this. You walk into a room that you haven't had very good experiences with, all the memories flood back. And that was equally true for them. So the idea of distance is certainly a part of it. And then the last one here is this bull crap that people say about time heals all wounds. Time metastasizes things if nothing's done. It makes things far, far worse. So this kind of old saw that people say about time, it depends on what you're doing with it as to whether it's going to heal wounds or not. And whether or not there's any, at least initial attempt to try to heal the wound right out of the gate on top of it. Because I can't imagine, but I mean, a lot of you guys know I had an accident where I fell off a roof and I fractured my femur, and it would be a little bit like somebody saying, just walk it off. It'll be fine. You know, I mean, time heals all wounds. It'll heal. It's like, but if it's dramatically broken, then no. If anything, walking it off would make it worse. Well, guess what grief is? Any kind of grief. It doesn't get better with time. It doesn't, and it doesn't age like a fine wine. It turns into vinegar. and it impacts everything. It impacts everything in every relationship and all the interactions, particularly impacting with people who even want to help. When I refuse to go through some of the stuff that's contained in my losses, then somebody comes alongside and seems to be willing to help. Guess what they become? The target. Because they dare to kind of walk into the middle of that. So a few of the observations, at least within the context of grief and talking about the whole boundaries thing, and the challenge even of walking with somebody else through it all, not to mention just walking with ourselves through it all, and what comes with it. So now, before I leave this behind, any questions you guys have in the whole boundaries area when it comes to this? See, I ask questions just so I can take a drink. Yeah.
You said boundaries are not walls and they're more like gates.
Right.
How does a good friend approach a gate? And how does a good friend get through the gate? Or does a good friend need to get through the gate?
Well, that would be the question. But you know the easiest way to get through a gate?
Open it.
You knock. Actually, I think the more accurate phrase would be boundaries are fences with gates in them. And so generally, I think we ask to enter rather than assume that we need to enter. Now, that also means that I think we can ask, is it okay, that we have this conversation? But I think whether or not I need to be inside the walls of that person's heart has to be their choice. And I have to find a way to make that possible. And so, the metaphor of knocking, I mean, the funny thing about it, the funny thing about it is very biblical. Because you go to Revelation, and what does Jesus say? I stand at the door and, which also means that whoever's on the other side of the door doesn't have to open it. They don't have to open it. And so I think, I'm not sure we think about that very much. I mean, obviously, in a lot of cases, when somebody asks, it almost isn't really an ask, it's a demand, and then we feel duty-bound or obligated to let them in, even though they may not be the best person at the time to let in. Yeah, Cass?
Yeah, and I've had class with you before, and we've talked about this plenty, but I guess for me, it's in practical life, I feel like it's hard to have someone knocking on your gate or knocking on your
Right.
door without being allowed to not answer. It almost comes off as rude if you do have boundaries. And that's what I've struggled with in practical life of I set up these boundaries, but then I feel rude about or feel bad about having them. So that's what I'm struggling with.
Well, that would be a double bind.
Yeah.
So I go to all the effort to make the boundary, and then when somebody asks, I feel rude because I don't let them through the boundary.
So I just don't know how to. I don't know. Maybe this is a conversation for another time. But I guess how. I don't even know if I can really ask a question. I don't know how to word it, but just how do you have those boundaries with a gate, with being allowed to not answer it.
So who gives you permission to not answer it?
I don't know.
What's a friend for? Answers your question for you. Yeah, I think that's where the issue is it not? Because the one observation I've made before is that the longer I've been at this of teaching and being, working with people and talking with people, the longer I've been at it, the more this issue of boundaries has become more and more of an issue. And it seems to me that as each generation passes, what I see is more and more of a prohibition against having boundaries, which means that societally, we're giving each other the message that you're not allowed to have boundaries because I don't either. And if you do, you're being insensitive and rude, like you're saying, Cass. So how do I get through that? Well, I think I get through that maybe confronting my own propensities for wanting to have boundaries, but not wanting to pay consequences for having boundaries. Because there's going to be consequences for having boundaries, which means saying no, and somebody gets sideways about it, and and then I guilt myself about not having them, when in fact they're not taking my no for an answer. That's a bigger issue in my mind, is that I say no and somebody doesn't like it and tries to guilt me into not saying no. I got a bigger issue with that. And so I think I have to contend with both sides of the fence here. One is my own propensity to obligate myself to somebody that asks for something. They don't obligate me. I mean, the problem in most of our conversations is that we will ask for something when it's not really an ask at all. It's an expectation and a demand. And we kind of know this dance. And so then when we violate the rule, somehow we feel guilty as a result of it all. So I think that might be part of that conversation. Any other questions or anything? All right, well, there's one last one I wanted to take some time to talk about. And it is probably one of the tougher of them, but every bit as important. And it has to do with this. is in the realm of loss, whether to death or otherwise, we have to do something with and talk about forgiveness. Now that, at some level, that there's some parts of that doesn't make sense, because it's like, who do I have to forgive if somebody's died? It's not like they chose to forgive. And quite honestly, it doesn't really matter. Because how I experience it, little T truth, how I experience it is that I have been abandoned. And I have to figure out what to do with this when we talk about the issue of forgiveness and where it lands in this conversation. When it comes to other losses, broken relationships and loss of my sense of myself and things like that, there may be actually people that are active in it, that I have to figure out a way to forgive, because that releases me from them. And that's one of the keys to keep in mind, is that God gave us a means to separate from other people, and particularly when there's pain in that relationship, and forgiveness is that way to go. We don't like it because we end up playing these cards that are all myth cards. And the one myth is if I forgive that person, then I'm saying it's okay what they did to me. And that's probably one of the more important ones. So, answering the question, why forgive, right out of the gate, and a lot of you guys have heard me talk through this, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time. There's a lot more that I can say clearly about it. But one of the reasons why we forgive is because of our forgiveness. Now, that is offered us without obligation. It is offered us freely. I think we all know that. It's offered us freely. The next step or the next action is ours. Because if I've been forgiven, then how do I relate to other people in my life? And I've got to deal with the dissonance, because I've been forgiven and I refuse to forgive other people. And that impacts where it all starts, and that is what God has done for us in terms of forgiveness. It's the basis on everything. And a lot of you have heard me talk about the example of the ungrateful servant and all the amount of debt that he had and all that goes along with that. And that was Jesus' answer essentially to Peter's question like this, is why forgive and how many times do I have to forgive? And more often than not, when we ever ask those kinds of questions of how or how many times, we're trying to limit it so that we don't have to do it. So God is the ultimate creditor. He takes the risk of forgiving us and setting the record straight. And the interesting thing about that is that in 1 John talks about Jesus being our advocate and our propitiation. Advocate is the same word as lawyer or counselor. And it's also the same word as paraclete, one called to come alongside. So Jesus is not only the one called to come alongside, but also the one to pay the payment so that I can be free. So we always have to contend with the original anchor to forgiveness at all, and that is ultimately what God has done for us. The second one is equally as important, and why forgive? Because it sets me free. It sets me free. Most of the time when we struggle with forgiveness, whether that's somebody who's died, this one is very, very near and dear to my heart, because I spent 10 years condemning my dad for leaving me. And you say, well, you're not being rational. I don't have to be rational. I can be hurt. And I had to work through that. And you say, well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it, to forgive somebody who died? No, it's not. Because what I do when I don't forgive is I hang on as tightly as I know how. I hang on tightly, and I hang on so tightly even though it hurts me. And the interesting thing about a lot of times when we live in unforgiveness is that we hang on so tightly we never grow ourselves. We never grow beyond the relationship. We never grow beyond any of those things. I have, and again, I know some of you guys have heard this many times, but the phrase of what is unforgiveness like? It's like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. And we say, I'm going to stunt my growth and do everything I can until you come back here and make it right. Forgiveness always involves a debt. Somebody always owes us something. It was a frame, or it was a phrase that everybody knew. Ironically, you go into the financial sector, this is a very understood term in the financial sector. When you forgive somebody's debt, it's always connected to a debt. And when you forgive it, they no longer have claim against the person who has had the debt. Yeah, Nemi?
So what happens, like, okay, so if someone is still in your life, like they're still alive, but they completely cut themselves off from, like, I've had, like, a very bad relationship with my mom right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just, like, wondering, so she's still alive, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
I think I should forgive her.
Well said.
But it's like so hard because she doesn't like love me.
Yeah.
So what happens when you want to forgive someone but they don't love you? It's like it's a completely one-sided relationship.
So the forgiveness is a one-sided thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're a little tentative. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we'll talk more about that. Some of this you've seen before.
Yeah.
It may take a number of iterations to finally land the plane, because forgiveness is one-sided.
Oh.
See? She's got to go through it at least 3 more times before we'll finally land the plane on that one. That response was precious. Yes?
But what if you want to have a relationship with the other person and you want to forgive them, but they're not there? Like, what happens then?
Yeah, but I mean, you're describing 2 issues. You're really trying to conflate these things together. I want to have a relationship and I want to forgive her.
Yeah.
But I can't have a relationship, she ain't interested, but I want to forgive her. It's the quickest way to teach it. Thank you for that. I can move on. You're right. I mean, that's just it. And I have a video at the end that you may or may not enjoy.
I think I will.
Yeah, none of you have seen it. Okay, none of you have seen it.
You haven't shown it in any of your classes?
I haven't shown it in any of my classes. I saved it just for this one. So don't ruin it for the other section, because it's my version of an ambush. Yeah.
Okay, then never mind.
No, you're not going to pull that on me, Debbie. No, never mind. It's Rosanna Dana. You guys don't remember that, but go back to SNL 20-some years ago. And she would go off, I forget who it was, Ruth Buzzy or somebody like that. And she was this little old lady that was dressed up and would go off on jewelry. Okay? Jewelry. And she thought it was jewelry. And she was talking about Jews. Okay? Yeah, it would never fly today. It would never fly today. I mean, it's like Tropic Thunder, right? I mean, Robert Downey Jr. was in blackface.
Amazing.
You never know where I'm going. I mean, you never know. And she would go off on this for 5 or 10 minutes, and the other host on SNL would be looking around going, what is she doing? And he would say, well, jewelry is not the same as jewelry. And she goes, never mind, and just goes out. So yeah, that's my reaction to never mind. Good Lord, how do I get on this stuff? All right, so me. All right, third one. The other person, this is not going to get any better, Nemi. I'll just warn you.
It's not gonna get any better.
Why forgive the other person? Is it frees them. It frees them.
It frees them, but does it freeze you? Does it free you?
Let me pull up a chair. We can have the counseling session and let everybody listen in. Yes, it does. Why forgive? Because it does free me. And why forgive? Because it releases me from the other person. And that's the thing, okay? Is the image that comes up in my mind is that, you know, I I have my hands around the neck of this other person and saying, you owe me, and you owe me, and I'm not letting go until you owe me. Now, obviously not literally, we're doing that. Yeah. Maybe we are, I don't know. But I mean, it would be a little bit like me driving down Alameda. I get hit by a drunk driver. I go off to the hospital with 2 broken legs, and the doctor comes in to try to fix my legs. I say, don't you dare fix them until that person comes in here and tells me that they did it wrong.
Oh.
My healing's in my own hands, and forgiveness is the tool to that healing. And God made that available to us in our relationships. The ideal would be somebody who recognizes how they've hurt us, who repents of that. But if I couple these 2 things together, forgiveness and repentance, I am forever connected still. They were never meant to be that way. In a lot of cases, when we say, I won't until that person does, you might as well chain yourself to the person. And all too often, that is oftentimes what I'll say. So you plan to be chained to this person for the rest of your life. The person that you don't like very much, or who hurt you really badly. You want to get chained to this person. And a lot of times we get very belligerent and resistant to it and say, I don't care. I don't care. I'll wait. Because I want what? Justice. And forgiveness is about grace. This is a hard grace. This is the kind of grace we don't like. Oh, we like it for us. Yeah, sure. But I'm not so sure that's true for other people. So it is for the other person. The other thing is, these only get better. The last thing is the community of believers. And this is the one that we don't really account for. Because what happens in our lives when we are wrestling with unforgiveness for whomever or whatever or what goes on, it will contaminate the emotional water table of my life. Okay? Now, you guys remember, I've told you this story before about Love's Canal. You all remember that story? Some of you don't, I'll tell you it again. But there was a small community outside of Niagara Falls, New York, and the brainiacs that lived that worked in Albany, the government types, decided that they got this wonderful idea of creating a canal between the St. Lawrence Seaway and another river up there. I forget which it was, or maybe it was the Niagara River. Well, anyway, they decided, and they embarked on billions and billions of dollars to create a canal between these 2 rivers to try to link them together and be able to move more things into that particular area in New York. Well, as many things happen with government and so forth, it became a bridge to nowhere. And it got abandoned because there was no money. And so here sat a canal with concrete sides, empty for 20 some odd years. And eventually somebody asked, so, you know, they had a nuclear power plant outside in that area. And they said, what do we do with the toxic waste that comes out of this nuclear power plant? Well, they said, I got an idea. We've got an empty cement container called a canal outside. Let's put it there.
Oh
Great idea. Like I said, wizards of smart. So they do that, and 55-gallon drums are buried in this canal under 75 feet or more of soil, thinking, what a great idea. We'll contain it. Well, fast forward into time, the area around Niagara Falls is growing, the tourist trade is getting even more, they need to bring in more people to work that tourist trade, and they're looking for ground to develop communities so they can house people that work there. Well, another person comes along and says, what about that empty track over there with all this empty dirt and everything else? It's like, great idea, so let's build. And a little community called Love's Canal was built over a canal filled with toxic waste. Over time, New York Health Department began to get filtered reports about birth defects and about what do I want to say, youth leukemia, all sorts of cancers, other issues in regards to or related to cancers that were showing up, and they couldn't really figure out why. So they think, well, maybe it's the soil. That's a thought. And they drill down and they find out that the soil under Love's Canal is thoroughly contaminated. And they drill down farther and they tap into one of these 55-gallon drums, which, oh, by the way, had cracked open and leached into the water table around Love's Canal. People had been drinking water contaminated with toxic waste. What we do with unforgiveness, what we do with unresolved emotions, is it gets buried and we say, there, that'll contain it, but it leaches into our emotional water table, and unforgiveness is a primary aspect of that. And it contaminates everything. We don't make any connections to that. We only see the effects that it has on our relationships and the capacity. I told you guys when I told you my story, after my dad died, I said, I will never love again. And I pointed out to you, did I love again? Yes, but I loved again very, very conditionally. It had contaminated my emotional water table. So I kept even someone that I said I loved at arm's length because I knew or believed that she was going to leave. Now, thankfully, 40 years later, I've been proven otherwise. And that's a part of, I think, the effect unforgiveness has to our relationships at large. So when I talk about the community of believers, I'm talking about the community that we live in, and some of this stuff leaches into the emotional water table and impacts our relationships, even with people that aren't even involved anymore. Okay. Yeah, Nemi. Okay. It goes on, so. All right. So let's talk some of the building blocks. Now, again, I'm building this and your awareness up around this issue, and then I will begin to drag it into the area around grief, okay? Because it matters a lot. Because sooner or later, most of the time, as I've talked to people about loss and grieving, sooner or later, paths lead through forgiveness in one way or another. So there are two different kinds of forgiveness. There's the superficial and the genuine. Real easy divisions. The superficial forgiveness is, oh, I'm sorry, that's okay version. It is a social convention. It is a little social dance that we do because we don't want to ruffle any feathers. We don't want the other person to feel bad, and it's a superficial kind of forgiveness. It's one that we say, it's okay, no worries. A lot of times that's the phrase we use, and we just keep moving on. The problem is even when there is real, authentic hurt, we still do this. And one of the things that I notice, at least, having been a counselor for so long, is a lot of people will come in and say, I thought I forgave this person. And a lot of it was because they did this kind of forgiveness. They say, oh, don't worry about it. Yeah, I'm a sinner just like you. I forgive you. And don't really do the work. The thing that's interesting, just as an aside, is that when we get to, and we'll look at these, what's today, Thursday, no, next Tuesday. When we look at the mile markers for grief and some of the models you have, when you look at the process of forgiveness, they almost come directly in line with one another. The process is a lot the same. A lot the same. Okay, Nemi?
Yeah, okay, so I've had a real problem with forgiveness. Like, how do I say this? I want to forgive people like God does, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you know, like, when you actually forgive someone versus when you're like, okay, I forgive someone?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you can say you forgive someone and not really mean it.
Right.
Yeah. How do you
I'm getting there.
differentiate that?
I'm getting there.
You getting there?
Yeah, because I mean, the issue is the decision to forgive
Yeah,
versus the
yeah.
process to forgive.
Yeah.
Okay? So since you've been through this routine, you probably know what's coming. So, yeah. Catherine, you had your hand up?
Oh, yeah. Come back to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this talk always, I lose people to their own thoughts. Okay, so that's superficial. What about genuine? So what does genuine forgiveness? Okay, Catherine, jump in. Yeah, this is only going to get more entertaining the farther in we go. Yes.
Yeah, so kind of going along with this idea of genuine forgiveness and how it's a process and a decision. Yeah, I guess my question is like, is it okay that forgiveness takes time? Like, I think I feel guilty for needing time
Mm-hmm.
to forgive.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I would answer it with a question. Is it okay that grieving takes time?
Yes. Yes, and yes to your question. Yes.
Because they're related. Because they're related. They are. Which means, by the way, and I've given this example, some of you have heard me say, when Lynn and I were raising our girls, and I had wrestled with this a lot through counseling and through my own and all of that. I've wrestled with it a lot. And we landed on a process, because again, I mean, it's 4 girls. They fight all the time. I mean, it's claws everywhere. So, and I just try to stay out of the way and not lose a body part. But the thing that we said, both Lynn and I said, is that when there is an offense between two of them, that we're going to split these things apart. And when one has hurt the other, offended the other, whatever, and there's some conversation about that with the offending party, and they decide that they want to make things right with their sister, and they go and say, I'm sorry, I hurt you. I know that was really an offensive thing to say. Of course, a 6-year-old wouldn't say that, but and the one thing I asked and kind of instructed or even trained my kids is for the other person to say, thank you. That's it. Not, it's okay. Because it isn't okay. It isn't okay that her sister sought to hurt her intentionally. It is not okay. The second part of that is working through how that other person has been hurt, the other sister, and working through forgiveness and releasing the demand that the other sister say they're sorry. Now, they may have preemptively done that, because I sincerely believe that we have gotten repentance and forgiveness all tangled up together, and we've made them conditioned on each other. I'll forgive if you repent. I'll repent if you forgive. And that's just so thoroughly anti-scriptural, it makes me crazy. We all naturally do that because we want guarantees. We don't want to stick our neck out and have somebody not reciprocate. Because we think the lack of reciprocation negates what I just did. So if we separate those things out, then I've been hurt and I need time. I need time to sort out that. What is that time? What am I going to do during that time? I am moving toward the release, the forgiveness. Because that's what forgiveness is. It's canceling the debt that the person owes me. And and that's not a once and done deal. It's a decision and a process, and that's what I want to highlight for you. So what does the process look like? It looks a little bit like this. First and foremost, if I'm going to engage this process of forgiveness, then I have to start with recognizing how I've been hurt. Recognizing the injury. I have had plenty of people that stumble on this one first. Actually, all three of these, but first two they stumble through because they say, they say, why dredge up all of these feelings just to feel them again? What's the deal? Why? Why is this helpful? Because there's a wound, and the wound has to be healed, and the way to go about healing it is to tell the story about how it happened. So I have to start with how I've been hurt, and secondarily identify the feelings that go along with that. Ironically, members of my family have gone through this, my wife most recently, and I literally quoted that. What I said people would say, that's what she said to me. So why do I have to go back through this again? What good could possibly come from it? Well, telling a story allows us, a little bit like grieving, telling the story allows us to incorporate what happened into our own timeline. Because when things happen, or somebody dies, or we lose a relationship, our timeline gets cut. And we say, well, I'll jump over that cut and then I'll move on. But there's still a cut back here. There's still an emptiness back here. And what I have to figure out a way to do is to tell the story there so that I begin to weave a new story that includes what's happened to me as well. And the feelings that come with it. Because feelings connect different parts of ourselves with it. If I'm just telling a news story, that doesn't really accomplish much. But news anchors make a really big deal of being objective and not showing a lot of emotion or anything like that. And we sure sit up and pay attention if you see a news anchor get really, really upset with what they're speaking. Why? Because it brings parts of us together while we watch somebody else do that. So I have to identify how I've been hurt. Why? Because that's the terms of the note that you hold against that other person. The terms of the note is how they've hurt me. And usually I have terms that say, you hurt me this way, then this is what I need from you, and this is what I need from you, and this is what I need from you. And that's part of identifying the feelings. Expressing those feelings sometimes can come in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they come in the form of writing a letter that you never send. They come in the form of having a trusted friend who you can count on that isn't going to fix it, that's just going to say, vent away. You can say whatever comes out your mouth and the feelings you have, I'm here and I'll just listen to it and I'll ground it for you, and then we can go on. And you can incorporate it. Yeah, Demi.
So, if you skip this process, like if you like withdraw yourself from feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and then you realize that you like are hurt afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
like how do you don't go through this process, like can you go back?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think in images sometimes.
me all the time. Yeah.
Okay? So, imagine this being our life timeline, and we lose somebody
Yes.
or a relationship, and it's just a complete blowout. And we experience the emotions in the middle of that, but we end up wanting to do one of these and keep going like this. But the blowout's still there. And quite honestly, I use this is really fresh, because I use exactly this example with my wife. She had left a school she had been at for 16 years. She had left under some really difficult circumstances. People had impugned her character. They had done things that just she wasn't at all. And she felt very unjustly characterized and everything else. Put into a job that she couldn't do well. It impacted her own security as a teacher, all of that stuff. And she, she's over here and saying, this has leaked into my emotional water table. As a matter of fact, it impacts even how she grieves the loss of her mother, which is the sweet lady I showed you on the screen. It impacts that. It impacts her relationships with her kids. Because once we clamp down on the emotions that come out of here, it stays clamped down. It's a package deal. You close one down, they all get closed down. Now, they'll seep out, okay, just like Love's Canal. But she comes back here and says, all right, I'm going to start telling the story. I'm going to start feeling the feelings. I'm going to put it in perspective, and now I've got a new timeline that incorporates the things that were part of that blowout, that loss. What did I just describe? Grieving and the process of grief.
Yeah.
That's just what I described. That's why I'm saying there is such a parallel between forgiveness and grieving. There's a lot that are similar here. So, let me land this and then we'll get to the better stuff. Particularly when we're around people who continue to act in ways that created the harm that we experienced, maybe even the loss we experienced, we have to find a way to set boundaries to protect ourselves. That's why I talk about boundaries before I talk about forgiveness. Because we have to find a way to create a healthy distance or put a demarcating line, fence, between me and the other person that limits their continued impact on me during that time. Now, most of the stuff that you read or hear talked about with forgiveness usually seems seem to emphasize the decision, but they don't talk nearly enough about the process. Okay? I chose to forgive somebody. That's great. That's great. But it's a start. It's not the end of the process. And what you'll notice is, at least in terms of how this is laid out, there are at least 3 other processes that we have to engage in before we ever get to the point where it's canceling the debt. And, you know, my own, and this is just mine, but my own quick and dirty definition of forgiveness is releasing my demand from somebody else to change. It's releasing my demand, because that's what oftentimes we get stuck in when we're talking about forgiveness. And that's what canceling the debt is. If I go into my banker and say, cancel the promissory note on my house and cancel that debt, what do? Well, first they'll want to know how much. And then secondly, they'll find a good shredder and they'll shred it. It's as if the debt never existed. Now, it needs to be said, in terms of something that Catherine asked. Once I start through this process, a lot of times it's a daily process. I have to continue to remind myself that this is a canceled debt, and that I'm going to have to, over time, release this person of the demand that they change. Is it just? Well, heck no. But grace isn't either. Mercy is way beyond justice. So consider, pray, seek reconciliation. Reconciliation is only possible if one party forgives and repents and the other party forgives and repents. And that's that's part of what we have to talk about. And I have a little diagram, and I'm not going to put that up right now. So within grief, this same process of forgiveness can be applied. Yeah, Dana?
I have a question about like the releasing my demand for someone else to change. I thought that like last semester, in like the context of grace, that like grace also involves change, and so what do you like, where does change come in? Like
You look like you're bracing yourself.
I'm not.
Because who's in charge of the change?
Well, they are.
Yes, exactly. They are. But I release my demand that they change. So it's about my demand. It's not about the change. Because I'm still going to have boundaries.
Okay.
So that even if they don't change, I still have a way to limit the effects of that person's behavior and everything on there. I quite honestly, I would still put it all under the umbrella of grace, because it creates the possibility for change. It doesn't create the change,
Okay.
but it creates the possibility for change.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Nemi.
I have a really random question.
Well, we're on a roll. Why not?
Okay, so like, if someone doesn't want to change,
Yeah.
but like, God wants them to change, is God gonna like overrule them? Or just like the person have to like, okay, so if you have free will, never mind. It's a loaded question.
How does God do it with you?
He,
I mean, if you don't want to change,
yeah.
he's not going to strong arm you into change.
I want to grow and change.
Well, sure.
He definitely does that. Yeah, he teaches me some lessons. So like,
Yeah.
is it because I want to grow and change? Like, say I didn't want to grow,
Right.
but I needed to as a human being.
Yeah.
To be like a better person.
But do you see that as a need?
like, say I didn't, does God be like, oh.
Well, I don't think God doesn't do the hands-off thing, but I mean, I think it's fair to say God's limited by my choice.
Okay.
I think He's if I say take a flying leap to God,
I would think so too. Free will, right?
right. Now, it doesn't mean He doesn't continue to move and do things. It doesn't mean that at all. Does that mean that if I say, God, take a flying leap, will I see that movement? No, probably not. But that doesn't betray the fact that He's still moving.
Okay.
So I think one doesn't have to negate the other, I guess is the point.
Awesome.
Yeah. Vivian?
Okay,
Yeah.
so say that you genuinely forgive someone.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like bad or uncommon if like sometimes we still like think about the gap and like are sad or resentful in a way, even if like because it like seeps into other areas of your life?
Right.
Even though like you did and you feel like you really did actually forgive them.
Sure.
Is it bad to feel that way sometimes?
Lost me.
No. I'm just loading up. Is all I'm doing. You know what this is called actually in our timeline? A scar. And scars carry memories. I don't have a scar from my accident. I do have a scar from pulling on a chain once. And every time I look at it on my hand from the stitches that got put into it, I will never forget it. And the scar that's left behind is either more sensitive or less. It's another reminder of it. I'm also one of the few people you'll ever meet that actually grows hair out of the side of my finger. Because as a little second grader, somebody locked me out of a glass porch and I decided to do a Superman thing and went straight through with my hand, shredding the side of my finger. And they rushed me off to the hospital, and a skin dermatologist, skin surgeon, said about the only way I can save his finger is by doing a skin graft. And he decided to take skin from the inside of my arm to graft it onto my finger, which allows it to work. See, I can point real well now. But on occasion when my wife and I hold hands, she says, "You really got to trim that. Can I do that?" "No, it really is really sensitive. Don't you dare touch it." But see, that's what scars do for us. Am I saying that it's not healed? No, it's completely healed. But I still remember. And I think that's one way to think about it. Because our timeline has scars in it. And they're reminders of impacts and things that happen. And sometimes they offer perspective that we wouldn't otherwise have. That is it not forgiven? No, I don't think so. I think it's just a different thing. And scarring is healed, but it's just a reminder of healing more than anything else. Okay. The other thing I'd clarify for you is this annoying phrase I hear people say all the time, and I do everything to hold my snarkiness back, but I put it up on a slide instead. And that is this nonsense of forgiving yourself. Because it's like appealing to a kangaroo court. The judge, jury, and execution all agree. So this notion of forgiving myself is actually an evasion from living in grace. Because I'm using the terms of forgiveness when it's not forgiveness at all. It's the terms of acceptance. An acceptance of grace to live freely as I was intended. But like I said before, sooner or later, forgiveness is always part of grief and part of the conversation there. So, okay, how much time do we have? 4 minutes? Good. It's just enough time for you to see this. And then we'll talk about it next week. I'll get through all these things. Okay. Nope, that is not it. It's not Catalina, I don't think. Okay, here we go.